The Dating Game Killer by Hollywood and Crime contains depictions of violence and is not suitable for everyone. Please be advised.
From Wondery, this is Hollywood and Crime. I'm Tracy Pattin. Today, our special episode of The Dating Game Killer, L.A. Serial Killers, a conversation. I'm here today with retired LAPD detectives Tom Lange and Bob Souza. They're the co-authors of a great new crime book, which I just started reading, Malice in Wonderland, about the Wonderland murders. So Tom and Bob were part of our Season 3 special episode where our writer-director Larry Brand interviewed them about being lead detectives on the case. They gave us an insider's look into the robbery and revenge rampage that led to 4 gruesome deaths in the summer of 1981. And also with us is true crime social historian Joan Renner. She has a fascinating blog called derangedlacrimes.com, and she's the author of The First and the Latest Aggie Underwood, the Los Angeles Herald, and the Sordid Crimes of the City. That is one long title. Yes. And she's also a regular guest on Hollywood and Crime. So welcome to all of you. It's so great to have you all back.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. We're glad to be here.
Yeah. So before we begin, I just want to take a moment to remember our wonderful writer-director Larry Brand. He passed away in his sleep 2 weeks ago. I can't believe it was just 2 weeks ago. And I just want to say for me, I loved voicing Larry's powerful and beautiful words in seasons 2, 3, and now season 4. So we'd like to dedicate this season, The Dating Game Killer, to Larry. And you know what I was thinking when I was preparing for this? I was remembering all of us being at the LA Film Festival just last fall and being on that panel with Larry. So I'm just glad we all had that time together.
I just thought Larry was a real pro. I mean, if you wanted to learn something about what you do for a living, you want to meet that man and sit down with him, just watch him.
Yeah.
And he could push himself and push himself and push himself and then push himself some more. That was the type of guy he was. He just pushed the envelope until it fell off the table, and then he'd get up and do it again. Just a solid guy, a nice man, very objective, incredibly intelligent, and I just can't imagine anybody being any better at what they did than Larry was.
Larry had an immediate positive effect, even on my family who met him at the film festival. He was very interested in my granddaughter who was getting ready to go on tour, and her fiancé at the time, who's a professional drummer. And Larry showed such interest in what they were doing that when I told him about Larry passing, my granddaughter actually broke into tears. Mm-hmm. That's an effect he has on people from the beginning. It really impressed me when I met him the same way. You feel like you've known him all your life. Very, very pleasant man.
Yeah, that event was the first time I ever met him, and I was taken right away with his intensity. Such an intense person, and his intellect struck you right away. Yeah. Very quick, very sharp, and I loved his work ethic. I mean, it's like Tom said, you could tell he was the kind of person who would just push and push and push, and then take half a breath and push beyond. And I really admire that in someone. I'm just sad that I never had a chance to know him better.
Well, I'm so glad that he was able to hear when he was in production for The Dating Game Killer. He was able to sit and he put all the music together, of course, and he got to listen to how it all went. So for that, we're glad, and I know he's here in spirit. So let's just jump in and talk about this bizarre case, The Dating Game Killer, which is about the life and crimes of Rodney Alcala, who in the end turned out to be a serial killer. So, Tom and Bob, let's just talk about this notion of the serial killer name was named back then, right? And it became a thing. So how did that impact you in working in the homicide unit and all the work you were doing back then?
Well, back in the 70s and the 80s, when we were in robbery homicide, we worked in a specialized unit called Homicide Special Section. And we would work high-profile cases, serial killing cases that took time and effort, whereas a lot of other geographical divisions wouldn't have the time or the resources to handle. So we were moving along with cases like the Laurel Canyon case and a couple others, the Dorothy May arson murders, 25 people lost their lives there. And then all of a sudden you get this serial killer situation. When you have a murder investigation, you're not thinking that you're going to have a suspect involved in any other cases. It's completely different with a serial killer because you know that the killer is still out there. Killer is still active. On the Dorothy May or the Laurel Canyon case, it's over. Now we can get to work on the evidence and see if we can put this together for filing. Serial killer is completely different. You've got 1 or 2 victims out there. You link those victims, you know you have a serial killer. Mm-hmm. And so it changes a lot of things. It changes what you do as far as strategies and what you're looking for. And with a serial killer, one of the things you use in linking, we call linking the murders, is the MO, of course, the modus operandi. And we go beyond that to things like the signature. If there's body dumps, you look at the posing, which could be a signature. In other words, a signature is something in a serial killer that goes beyond the MO, something that should be kept just between you and the perpetrator. You don't want that out to the media. That's a big problem with a lot of serial killing cases, and some jurisdictions who don't have experience handling those, they let too much information out. Because this guy is still out there, or gal, there are women too who have been serial killers, you want to keep everything you have close to the vest, and that can be very difficult, especially when you get a lot of publicity in a case.
Well, Bob, weigh in about this.
That era was so unique. We were all seasoned homicide detectives. But when the serial killer era hit, we were kind of thrown into the deep end of the pool, and we had no real prior experience with serial killers. We had to figure it out. And the city, not only the police department, but the city attorney's office, everybody, the DA's office, everybody was concerned that the public should know, oh my God, there's a serial killer. We knew it was happening, but they wanted to keep it as close to vest as they could. But usually the press would break it wide open, and now we have to deal with it. But I think we didn't have serial killer profiling at the time. This was before the FBI really in Quantico just had their unit together. And so we were pretty much on our own figuring it out. And as these cases went on, our office we had a new task force almost weekly. And as the cases went on, we got better at it. We found out that we have to keep track of the clues. We have to prioritize the clues, which ones we had to bring in more teams just to handle clues because we had to handle the case in proper. So they would give us the top priority clues, and we'd run with those. Those were usually if we had a suspect, a license plate number, something that was substantial. But there were a lot of peripheral clues that had to be checked. And that's why we kept bringing in more and more people. And these task forces grew to 50, 60 officers that we were in charge of to make sure that they were doing what they should be doing.
Okay, Arisha, I want to tell you a story.
Okay, I'm pulling up my weighted blanket.
Okay, once upon a time, there was a young woman with hair as black as ebony and eyes the color of violets.
And her name was Snow White.
And her name was Elizabeth Taylor. And instead of 7 dwarves, our leading lady has 7 husbands, plus the best jewelry collection you've ever seen. Listen to the life and loves of Elizabeth Taylor on Even the Rich on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, the Wondery app, or wherever you're listening right now. Join Wondery Plus in the Wondery app to listen ad-free.
Okay, Joan, your background is social historian. You look at the impact of culture. And so in your book, Bob and Tom, Malice in Wonderland, you talk about the 60s through the 90s being the most high crime murders, the most murders happening in those decades. So my question to you, Joan, is what do you think was happening? Do you think the culture had something to do with it?
Well, it always has something to do with it, I think. But what I think a lot of experts have looked at this because it was a phenomenon. It didn't happen before. To my knowledge, it hasn't happened since. And so it was just this moment in time. So what was at play? There were a few things culturally, maybe that had some impact on it. The 70s, for instance, is known as the decade of decadence, and rightfully so. There were baby boomers were in their 20s, and they were going to bars and discos, and there were a lot of bad decisions fueled by Coke and naivete, maybe. And I think that culturally, maybe that made it easier. Whatever makes it easier for a killer, I think, is a victim pool. And I think that Hollywood in L.A. at that time was just an enormous, never-ending source of possible victims because you had a lot of people out and about. There was sort of a sense of a new freedom in the air. If you look at the women's movement, there were a lot of cultural touchstones, things going on that sort of fed into that. But I still don't think any of those things explains why serial killers, why Los Angeles, and why then? It's still sort of, it's like an unknowable, at least at this point, phenomenon. There's a lot of possibilities, but no real answers.
Well, you made a good point, a victim pool. I like that. It's a huge victim pool because if you look at the serial killings, we broke them down into 4 MO areas. And they include someone like the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, who would break and enter and commit mayhem, murder, rape, whatever. That was one type of M.O. You had another M.O., which would, the freeway killers, one of them Bob handled, the William Bonin case. We had 4 or 5 different freeway killers at the same time who would abduct women and men and mutilate the bodies sometimes, rape and everything else, and then dump the bodies along the freeways. Then you had just the regular stalk and kill. We had 4 serial killers involved in the Skid Row stabbings. And that of homeless people as well as the transients, 4 of those, again, just stalk and kill. So there were various MOs, but like you said, they were all part of a victim pool. I really like that, and it's true. That was probably a big reason for that. And again, this was before social media. This was before everybody had a camera. Yeah. This is before computers, really. People had cell phones. Today, everything has changed in the communications. These people could really get away with a lot more back then, quite frankly, than you could today.
There were so many murders at that time that we were called on quite often. We had visitors from all over the world that were concerned that this was going to branch out and involve other cities, other major cities. Just about detectives from almost every major city were contacting us. What is going on in Los Angeles? We had same thing with we had German, British detectives coming from Scotland Yard to see what was going on. In fact, I started lecturing out of state. There was a tri-state area in Arizona, and I'll never forget at one of our seminars, we had detectives from all over the Phoenix area. And one of them came up to me on the break and said, "Do you realize you handle more murders in a weekend than we do an entire career?" Because quite often we would get 3 or 4 in a weekend. And it was just absolutely mind-blowing. But at the time, all we thought was, this is what we do.
Yeah.
It was kind of normal to us. But now that we think back on it, detectives nowadays pretty well have it made with a third of the crime rate we had. So
We didn't have any time to worry about that.
you didn't have time to think
Nobody
about
worked 8 or 10 hours. I mean, we at Laurel Canyon were there for over 30 hours.
And Laurel Canyon Wonderland murders.
Yes.
And that was I was going to say what cases really stand out for you guys. And I know the Wonderland murders was the first time you two worked as a team in a high-profile case.
Yes, that's true. I think the Dorothy May fire stands out to me. Innocent people all died in a senseless fire. It was a young man who was getting back at his uncle, and he started the fire. And like the arson investigators we worked very closely with, they said if he was a professional arsonist, he couldn't have done any better. It was perfect.
So he
perfect
just got
condition.
lucky.
He got lucky. Perfect conditions, but 25 people died. And that was a tough one because all the bodies were at the coroner's office at the same time, and I just stood the autopsies one by one. And it just went on for 2 or 3 days, and it was devastating. One of our detectives actually went off with an emotional problem because he was involved in that case with us. But it involved a lot of other things that we'll do that on another show.
We've got a lot more shows. We got many more shows.
But that's a memorable case, and I'm sure Tom's got others too.
Well, publicity-wise, obviously the Simpson case. But I have to tell you, Simpson case to any homicide cop is what we call a turkey on a platter. 90% of murders, you're going to have something exculpatory. It's normal. Any investigator looks for exculpatory evidence in his investigation. It's only going to strengthen his investigation or her. But as far as the Simpson case, there was nothing exculpatory, which is very rare in a murder case. Every single thing of a substantive nature in Simpson was inculpatory, down to the shoe size of the bloody footprints at the scene.
So what does inculpatory mean then? It's the
Inculpatory
opposite.
means evidence that shows that your particular suspect probably committed the crime. And I'll give you a quick example of that. In Simpson, I like to use Simpson because it's so easy. I mean, there were many suspects eliminated, but all the evidence only went in one direction. That was to O.J. Simpson. There was a bloody footwear impression at the scene, very clear. And alongside the bloody footwear impression, there was a trail of blood tailing to the rear of the location, so we knew that the suspect, whoever that was, had a wound somewhere on the left side of their body. That footwear impression was 12 inches. When we did the search warrant at Simpson's house, I grabbed a pair of his shoes and asked him if these were his, and he ever worn them. He said, yeah, in fact, I wore those last night. They were size 12. We had size 12 bloody footwear impressions at the crime scene. If those were size 10, that's exculpatory evidence. That would be something the defense would want. That's normal in any case, but that didn't have any. But again, that's a turkey on a platter. Now, nobody wants to buy into Simpson as a suspect. Quite frankly, that's their problem. The most difficult and perplexing case we had is the one that Bob and I had, though, to me, was the Wonderland case, because it took 20 years. And every facet of a police investigation was involved at one time or another. So for me, it's the Wonderland case.
Yeah, that was a pretty gruesome case, and it's so fascinating to watch. We were just talking about this, the stuff that's on YouTube now, how you can watch crime scenes.
Sure.
And watching you guys go through that crime scene and describe what was going on was shocking to me that we have access to that. It's like a whole new world now.
There was an internal investigation regarding that and many other things in that particular case also, because that videotape that it was 25 minutes. It was the first time that it had been done in California where the videotape was actually admitted into evidence, the crime scene video. And it was shown to several attorneys. It was shown in court. Through discovery, we had to turn that video over. So who knows how that thing got into the movie Wonderland, but it did. It was part of the trailer of the movie Wonderland. So somebody made some money on that thing. Those types of things perhaps should have been shown in open court. Perhaps we should have all of the defense attorneys, and in this case, there were at least a dozen attorneys
Oh, the
involved.
dream team, yeah, at least.
They all got copies of the video. So who knows what happened to it.
Joan, do you want to weigh in on your thoughts about it? Well, I mean, I keep thinking about the media and how everything's changed now, but back then, even with these sensational crimes, there's a problem, right, with this whole focus that the media puts on it. And then you guys are trying to do your job, and then all this
Well, now everybody has a
information gets
camera.
out.
They have a camera with them all day, every day. And there are people who actually bait cops, to try to get some damning video on them. It's appalling. It's nice that there is maybe there's a level of a feeling of safety that comes along with I have this camera. Murders still happen, rapes still happen. I think people are looking at their devices sometimes as a way to make money. I find that appalling too. And the thing with the crime scene videos I saw as when I was working with the Los Angeles Police Museum, we had, for something we were putting together, we had a copy of the Wonderland walkthrough. And that was one of the most revolting things I've seen ever. My personality is I'm fascinated with crime, but I like it in black and white. I like old film noir.
Me
I
too.
like,
Yeah.
I like the old black and white crime scenes. That's fine. I've seen some awful crime scenes before, but I prefer not to. And that Wonderland thing was just awful. And then once the press get their teeth into something, they can. I think one of the best examples of the press helping to blow a case was during the Night Stalker when Richard Ramirez went up to San Francisco and he committed. I see that Tom and Bob are both nodding their heads. They know where I'm going with this. He went up to San Francisco, killed Barbara and Peter Pan in San Francisco. Well, part of what was tying him to the crimes was a particular shoe, a particular brand of shoe, size of shoe. They had some excellent shoe prints as evidence of the suspect. And so he goes to San Francisco. He commits these crimes. At some point, LA, I don't know if LAPD went. I know Sheriff's Department went up to San Francisco. They're talking to detectives there. They think there's a link because it seems like there's a pretty obvious link between these cases. So they're talking. One of the things the cops all knew to do was say nothing to anybody. They're sharing the information among themselves, but we're not going to put it out there and make it public. So mayor of San Francisco at the time was Dianne Feinstein. We know her in another capacity now. I know her as kind of a ditz because I think what happened there was there's a news conference. She goes out and says, we have the shoe. we know what shoe the killer was wearing. And you can see behind her, any of the cops that were there, their jaws drop. It's like, what is this imbecile doing? She's out there telling. So the story goes, but I asked one of the detectives about this, and he said maybe it's not true. But as the story goes, Richard Ramirez took his Via shoes and pitched him over off the Golden Gate Bridge. One of the detectives, Sheriff's Homicide Bureau detectives, Frank Salerno, who worked the case too, said that wasn't really true, but it may have well been. Richard Ramirez, like a lot of killers, and I know Bob and Tom can talk to this, is that they keep up on the news too. They they're narcissists. They like to see them. They like to see stories about themselves in the newspapers. They like to see stories on television. And while he may have been a lot of things, he wasn't an idiot. Richard Ramirez was not an idiot. He was actually kind of bright, very articulate, and he was just evil. But he knew the shoes it was a type. What did he? So he was wearing different shoes. Again, this is the media taking something that should have been kept secret just for the teams working on the case and left alone. But she goes out to I don't know how that was going to get her votes. She's never had my vote ever for anything.
Those were Alva tennis shoes. And Gil Creel was the other sheriff who interviewed him. Gil's a good friend of mine.
I love Gil.
Good guy. And,
he's a sweetheart.
He's a very good cop, too.
Great cop.
And talking to Ramirez alluded to that. He said, I saw the mayor. I saw the press conference. Where are the shoes? What shoes? I mean,
what shoes?
Got rid of them.
If you've ever looked at luxury clothes, jewelry, and art and thought you'd never be able to own them, believe me, I get it. But thanks to The Real Real, you can own iconic luxury items at unreal value. The Real Real is the leading reseller of authenticated luxury consignment from top designers like Louis Vuitton, Gucci, Rolex, Cartier, and hundreds more at up to 90% off retail. New items appear on the site daily, and you can be sure of the quality of what you're purchasing because The Real Real employs over 100 brand specialists, gemologists, horologists, and art curators from around the globe who inspect thousands of items each day to ensure that every item is authenticated. Shop luxury the sustainable way. If you're a consignor, you can set up a virtual appointment today with The Real Real's luxury consignment team. Get 20% off select items with the promo code REAL. That's therealreal.com, promo code REAL for 20% off select items.
Our department, Daryl Gates was the chief through much of our serial killer era. And Gates, the thing I respected about our chief was that he would call us up to his office. He didn't want to talk to the captain of the division. He didn't want to talk to commanders and deputy chiefs. He wanted to hear from the actual detectives. So when you went into Daryl Gates' office, the ranking officers, they pretty much kept quiet because Daryl would talk to us direct. And he'd say, okay, guys, what don't you want me to put out? So we'd brief him, tell him everything he wasn't know about the case, but we have to keep this because of the polygraph key. We don't want you to say anything about this. So he was very attentive to that, and it really worked well for us because once these kind of polygraph keys get out there, it just destroys your case. I mean, because it's going to go to court someday. And now you have a serious problem if it's something the suspect knows. Just like this is a perfect example of that when Tom caught the OJ case. And I was fishing up in Northern California, and I just saw on this old TV in this little cafe, there was a black and white TV, and there was no sound. And I'm watching it, and I see the famous Bronco thing, and then I see Tom on the TV. I had no idea what was going on. So I called Tom, and I said, what's going on? He says, you haven't heard? I said, no. He says, OJ killed his ex-wife and her boyfriend. I said, does it look like a pretty good case? He says, I wish all of our cases were this good that we handled together. That told me a lot because Tom is a top professional, and he would never bullshit me. I mean, that was the real deal at that time. And then we all know what happened after that.
Oh, God, it's such a, well, that's, I just
25 years.
And I'll just say this, when I met you, I see you on that witness stand and watching when I watched the trial, so it was so surreal to meet you in person. And you were, you did become kind of a celebrity, and you were saying the paparazzi was chasing you and how hard that was for you. And that's the interesting thing about the thing for detectives and the media, and they're trying to do their job, and then they've got all this other stuff going on. Well, let's jump into Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer, which is I find it to be such a bizarre case. And one of the things that's so interesting is that most people don't know who he is, but he ended up, in the end, becoming this prolific serial killer. So what do you guys, I mean, you were on the force when this happened. You were both, right?
We were both on the department.
Okay, but you weren't on the case.
No, it was, we were on several other cases, and Alcala falls within one of those 4 or 5 snatch and torture and rape and dump cases that we were talking about with the young women. And one of the cases was found in Hollywood Hills. And so our unit got involved. Jack Holder, now deceased, was one of the investigators that handled that. And while it was a possibility, he was part of the Hillside Strangler Task Force, which was another task force we had with the Bono and Bianchi. So Alcala was being looked at for that, but he, of course, was convicted of that Balcom murder, along with several others. But what you look for, and you don't want to, there was a question about, well, why didn't the LAPD arrest him and book him? Anything you do in a serial killing case, you're working with a district attorney's office. And you don't want to be making probable cause arrests on possible suspects because you're just giving grist to the defense team when it goes to trial. You got to be very careful of that type of thing. So somebody else was handling Alcala, but he had crossed into LAPD jurisdiction, and that's a major, major problem when you have a bunch of serial killing cases. And we were looking at 7 or 8 at the time within a few years period of time. We had 4 or 5 different policing agencies. They weren't communicating. They weren't saying, well, we've got this, we got that. Bianchi on the hillside, we were one of the 3 agencies that were looking at him as a possible suspect, and none of the agencies knew it. And he actually went on a ride-along with LAPD past some of the dump sites, right in the middle of the killings. Bianchi did. So if we knew what Orange County was doing, there was a victim in Glendale, if we knew what they were doing, and they knew what we were doing, maybe that ride-along wouldn't have happened. Maybe that's a major problem, and it exists today. Because when I do instruction, and one of the first things that I talk about is a lack of communication. We used to go to work, we'd grab a cup of coffee, and we'd start making calls and setting up interviews with other police agencies and witnesses. We wouldn't do it over the phone, and we certainly wouldn't do it online. Today, they come in with a cup of coffee, they open their laptop, and they're trading evidence online. You don't do that. You got to go out, let's have a beer tonight, look each other in the eye, let me see what you're all about. And the same in the morning, have a cup of coffee, let's discuss evidence. You don't do it online. That's the problem that still exists today, that lack of communication.
That's so striking to me, because they talked a lot about that with 9/11. That was a huge problem.
Yep.
And if it's still this problem today.
It always comes down to the human element. And I saw it in the serial killer cases I handle, especially with Bonin. It involved several jurisdictions, as well as LA County sheriffs. And they were smaller, some of them were smaller departments. And luckily, my partner and I at the time, we established communication. He had a partner before me. John St. John was the lead investigator from the get-go in that case. They brought me in because his partner was a little arrogant and wanted to keep things kind of close to the vest. And the same with all these detectives. Everybody wants to be the one that gets the guy, And so they put me in to mix it up a little bit. Let's get to know these other detectives. I mean, let's have some kind of a rapport here. This is ridiculous. And so I tried to do that. And it worked. I mean, to a certain extent it worked. But Orange County, for instance, they had a suspect early on, Bill Bonin. And they followed him for a couple of weeks. They wrote him off. And so at these meetings, we'd have these big task force meetings. And, Bonin's no longer a suspect. We kind of discounted him. So we kind of accepted that. Well, Bonin killed 25 kids after that, young men. And they had let him go, but it wasn't completely their fault. But maybe we should have looked at him a little further instead of just writing him off as a suspect. So those kind of things, like Tom says, this communications issue, we really worked at having this rapport. We sit down and have drinks in the evening. We wanted to have a friendship and a working relationship as opposed to an adversarial, which quite often it was because everybody wants to be the guy, And John they were jealous of him because he got a lot of press being #1 detective. He was badge #1 and he was senior man. And it was a pleasure to work with John. He knew, I wish I knew as much as he had forgotten. But he was, anyway, and that was kind of a rub with her. So it came back down to communication, like Tom says. And even on the Manson case, I happened to work with Danny Galindo, who was the lead investigator on the Tate LaBianca. He swore that the LaBiancas was a copycat. He discounted it. He said it was the biggest mistake he ever made in his life. And he told me, that I was much younger than him at the time, fairly new detective compared to his 30 years. He said, Bob, remember something. Don't ever have tunnel vision, and don't ever think it's a copycat. Always think that maybe they're connected. He says it'll save you. And he was right. There's no question about it.
Speaking of copycat and the Rodney Alcala thing and the Hillside Strangler case, I think it was so interesting because at first, right, the LAPD thought it was Hillside Strangler because it was Jill Barcombe up in the Hollywood Hills, and the way she was placed, they thought, well, it's got to be the Hillside Strangler, right? So when it turned out to be Rodney Alcala, do you think he did this on purpose? Did he place the body like that, or do you think it was just
I don't think we'll ever know, but I wouldn't certainly put it past him. I mean, here's a guy who was there 3 trials, and on the 3rd trial he defended himself.
Exactly.
Made a complete ass out of himself. Something wrong with somebody like that. So he could have done that, I suppose. But we didn't know. Nobody knew.
And how did he get away with this for so long? I know there wasn't forensics back then, but that just baffles me that he was able. I mean, he went to New York, of course, changed his identity.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the whole crazy thing about the dating game. That story is so crazy, the way that the detectives saw him on the dating game just by chance. And it was a repeat, a rerun. And he had the hubris to appear on the dating game.
We were discussing that. We were discussing that with Joan about sociopaths. I'll let Joan address that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of it. That's part of it. It's for a sociopath. I mean, they're like Rodney Alcala is just a malignant narcissist. Everything's about him. His motive, if you're looking for a motive for the murders, it's sexual gratification. I don't think there's any other motive really there. It's not robbery. It's not any of the other things that you might commit a murder for.
Torture also.
Torture. Yeah. Again, sexual gratification. This is what he does. He enjoyed it, and I think in part, if there was a climate that created the pool of victims, there was also a climate that prevented him from doing any real time. I think the cops always had a feeling about him once they talked to him, and especially after he snatched the little girl in Hollywood. But there was a climate. Rose Bird, I'm sure that you remember her. She was the first woman, I think, on the California Supreme Court. Rose Bird was a fierce opponent of the death penalty, which is fine. That doesn't necessarily mean she's a bad jurist. What made her so destructive in a lot of these cases was that she wanted to fit the law to her point of view rather than understanding that the law is something that she had to fit her point of view to. You couldn't do it the other way around. So I think during her watch, I think there was something like more than 60 people were released, on appeal, because she just couldn't deal with the death penalty. This is part of the climate, and so I think Rodney Alcala was able to game the system. He's not an idiot, although as Tom said, he proved himself to be kind of a big idiot in court. But that was just a function of his narcissism. He thinks he's smarter than everyone else. But I think that where was I going with this? That help me out here.
Well, you were talking. Well, we were talking about
sociopaths and grabbing the limelight.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And I think that's another part of that puzzle is that he was good enough. I mean, he wasn't a bad-looking guy. He's not appealing to me, but he wasn't a bad-looking guy for the time. And he was on the dating game, right? Good enough for that.
And he got picked.
Well, she quickly saw that was a bad idea
because of the banana, which is so bizarre.
But yeah, it was. But I think in part he used his personality as a way to attract victims to him. So his personality wasn't displeasing. His looks weren't scary. So he used the same game when he was in prison. If you think that shrinks can't be fooled, you got another thing coming. And so he was able to say, a lot of times they kicked him loose. They thought he was cured. Whatever was wrong with him, he's fine now. Let's just send him back out. And because he did then move to New York, he went across the country a couple times. In fact, the most recent case attributed, the most recent trial or jury, whatever it was 2013. Those pictures, right, that were distributed, the hundreds of photographs he'd taken of women. Some of them couldn't be shown because they were so sexually suggestive. But a sister of a woman who went missing saw one of the photographs that was included in that whole array of photos. And she recognized her sister. And her sister had been missing. Right. And she said, oh, my God, I can tell it's her because she has something, a little crook in one of her little, in her baby toe. Yeah. And she recognized her. And sure enough, they were then able to, she'd been a Jane Doe forever. And she was on a motorcycle, posed on this motorcycle. The chances of it being Rodney Alcala, I'd say 99.999%. And of those photographs that are still people who haven't been ID'd, how many of them are victims? There's definitely more victims.
The Dating Game Killer is brought to you by Best Fiends. You know that moment when you reach for your phone, you look at the screen, and then you realize you can't remember why you picked up your phone in the first place. I'm really trying to avoid all the mindless scrolling we're all prone to, so lately, when I find myself picking up my phone, I play a few levels of Best Fiends. Best Fiends is this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game that's unlike other puzzle games out there, mostly because it feels like an adventure. You're playing strategically with these bugs, they're the fiends from the title, and your job is to help them defeat these slugs that have started taking over their land. Even though the game is casual, at every level you play, the objectives for each puzzle change. As you continue to play, the puzzles get a bit more challenging, and you get to think about strategy. It's hours of fun right at your fingertips, and you can even play offline. So check it out. With over 100 million downloads and tons of 5-star reviews, Best Fiends is a must-play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends.
In the aftermath of a shocking crime, people always ask why. Who would do something like that? Was it about power, ego, revenge? What makes people like that tick? In Wondery's new podcast, Killer Psyche, retired FBI criminal profiler Candace DeLong dissects the thoughts and motivations of the most infamous felons in history. With a career spanning nearly 5 decades, she sat across the table from hundreds of criminals and spent countless hours inside their minds. In every episode of Killer Psyche, Candace will unravel the psychology and instincts of America's most complex and disturbing figures, including high-profile cases that she personally worked on, like the Unabomber, and other cases like Christopher Dunch, a.k.a. Dr. Death, where her training and experience can help us understand what was going on inside his head. Was he delusional or a cold-blooded killer? To hear the gripping details of the most chilling criminals' minds in modern history, follow Killer Psyche on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or you can listen to new episodes early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app.
One of his signatures was the fact that he would pose as victims. And that's something that you look for in linking. It's also something you look for when you're trying to figure out what happened. When you pose a victim after you've murdered somebody and you dump them somewhere, that takes a little bit of time. So this guy had absolutely nothing going for him. I mean, he was a psychopath of the first order. He couldn't care less that he would take the time to actually pose a victim. And then also, he took trophies. He would take jewelry from some of his victims that he kept. And we had a couple of cases. Well, Skid Row Stabber was one. That's how we ended up nailing him, because he would take little trophies and keep them. So this is how some of these guys think. So in the photographs you mentioned with Alcala, he'd probably go and look at them from time to time and get off on it. I mean, that's what goes on in the minds of these total sociopaths. No conscience about anything or anybody. It's all about me and anything that I want to do with my victims, because they're under my control.
It's really unfortunate that some of these attributes these serial killers have, it's wasted on them. I mean, it's for really bad purpose. I think Bianchi and Bundy are two that come to mind. I mean, they were able to really seduce women. They had the charm, they had the charisma, and there's that other dark underneath where everything they did was nefarious. But they did have that ability. And Bittaker and Norris, not so much. They actually had to violently kidnap their victims and subdue them. And Bittaker never cooperated, but I was fortunate enough to be able to interview Norris. And Norris, in talking to him, it would be like us discussing where we're going to have lunch tomorrow. He's talking about how they would grab these young girls and how they torture them. But what we were there for really was to get an idea of his MO, his method of operation, of how they worked. We thought, well, maybe our serial killer is doing similar things. And he was the one that told us about you're looking for you're looking for a white guy. You're looking for a guy that probably has a van, and they use with a sliding door as opposed to one that opens out. They don't want people behind them or in front of them seeing what's happening. They can pull right up to the curb and grab a young woman right off the park bench, or entice her in with marijuana or alcohol, young girls. And that's kind of how they operated. And he would tell us these things that, as it turned out, Bonner did have a van with a sliding door. But he told us about how they would purposely try to fool the cops, and they had followed the freeway killer. They had followed those stories, said, well, we're going to start grabbing girls from different cities, and we'll dump them in another area. We'll confuse the cops. He said they had all that going on, and they had studied L.A. cops. They knew that L.A. cops and L.A. sheriffs, when they stopped you, they'd jack you up. They'd get you out of the car. They'd search the car, even though maybe they're not authorized to do it, but that's what they did. The smaller departments were more politically oriented. They would stop you. They might write you a ticket, but they're not going to get you out, and they're not going to search your car. So they liked operating in the smaller cities for that reason. So they knew. These guys aren't stupid. I mean, they know. And you always read these things about, well, serial killers really just want to get caught. Well, that's bullshit. They don't want to get caught. You know, they want to keep going. Bonin he loved killing young boys. So it's just interesting to me that the mindset is so wasted on an evil person. But
interestingly, we talk about pairs of serial killers. We actually had a pair, male-female, the Sunset Strip Killers, Doug Clark and Carol Bundy. And she'd pick up guys and take them out to the truck, and either one of them would kill them. In one instance, they beheaded I think she was a prostitute. They beheaded her, and Doug Clark would keep the head in the freezer of his refrigerator at home, made up with lipstick, mascara, and this type of thing. And from time to time, it'll be raunchy here, but what happens, he'd take the head out of the freezer and have sex with it.
Oh my! Was this a case you worked on?
I didn't work on that.
LAPD, Robert.
Leroy Orozco had it.
Yeah. Leroy. I worked along with him a little bit on the case, but
everybody works a little bit on each case. Yeah. But it's primary investigators. So it was another team that had that one. But this was part of that same era. All these things were going on at the same time, so everybody had a case going.
And it's so interesting. So today, is it not we don't hear about serial killers. So what has happened?
It happens, but not like this.
Quick statistic: 1992, the city of Los Angeles, 1,094 murders. Homicides. Sometimes people get homicide and murders mixed up. 1,094 homicides. People died. The vast majority of those 1,094 in 1992 were murders. Last year in the city of Los Angeles, 258. That represents over a 75% decrease in homicides from our period to today. So do they have as much to do? Probably not. Today, though, you have things like DNA. You have a cold case squad. What does a cold case squad do? They take unsolved murders and run all the evidence for DNA. That's a cold case, and they solve a lot of cases. The Southside serial killers we had in the mid-'80s in South Central Los Angeles. We looked at over 100 murders of prostitutes. We solved, I think, 6 or 7 of them pre-DNA. DNA came along, put this thing together, and in the 90s, we ended up getting 5 additional killers. The Grim Sleeper and several others cleared all those homicides because they have DNA. So that's perhaps one reason. Another I alluded to earlier was social media. Everybody knows everything about everybody.
They do.
And you got killers going online, for crying out loud.
And you wonder if there was social media back then, and the decades prior, it would have been a different world. Because, I mean, look at Rodney Alcala. I mean, he's on the dating game and nobody caught him. I mean, that was just the craziest thing. But today that would have never happened.
Well, part of what was going on, too, like in the 80s and stuff, you had the crack epidemic. So, again, you have a victim pool who, because with the South Side ones, they were primarily prostitutes, if I'm not mistaken. And most of them had drug habits. Right. Sometimes it's hard to say what comes first, the drug habit or the prostitution. It's not an easy way to make a living. I think you'd have to be drugged to want to do that.
You mentioned about that in the media. The media had to have a serial killer in the South Side.
Yeah.
But we would tell the media there's probably more than one killer, and many killers are tricks, other prostitutes, dope dealers, pimps. They all kill prostitutes. There's not one killer. And the media had, oh no, we got the South Side Slayer. The media is the one that
they like to name them,
South Side Slayer. Yeah. They wouldn't listen to us. And we had a 3-year task force at all of those murders. Cleared a lot of crime, but only a very few murders until DNA came along. Of course, today you wouldn't hear, oh gosh, we were wrong. There were several killers. But the media has to have conflict. Like Bobo says, a story is not a story unless there's conflict. And you got op-ed on page 1 now. It's been a problem for law enforcement, still is today.
Yeah, and prostitutes are an easy pool of victims. I mean, they have been since Jack the Ripper. Who did
all
he kill?
Over the world.
All over the world. Because they'll get into they get into situations with strangers. That's a recipe for disaster.
The problem exists everywhere in the world, killing a prostitute.
Yeah.
This particular era that Tom and I were so involved in, we talked about Wonderland quite a bit over the years. That's why we decided to write the book Malice. Since then, the more we talk, the more we realize what an anomaly that whole period of time was. And so we're now planning a second book, and we're going to call it Homicides and Ugly Business, and discuss a lot of cases. We did a little bit of that in this book. On one chapter, we kind of devoted it to other cases that we'd worked on in serial killer era, but we want to do a book. Now, there's so much interest in it at this point, and we were there. We kind of got tired of investigative reporters reporting on cases we handled. So it's our turn.
I was going to ask you guys what's next. So that sounds like a fascinating book.
Yeah, we're going to discuss a lot of cases in that book.
I'm looking forward to that because one of the things I like most about Malice is that you have these little asides, throughout. And it sort of it pulls you in, it draws you in. It's like you're there, because nothing happens in a vacuum. So you're working this case, you're working other cases too. Yeah. You don't just have it's not like you're assigned homework. This is your one case. You'll work it till it either comes to a conclusion or whatever. No, there's a constant rotation, and that's one thing I hope that you'll sort of continue to do in future books.
There's a reason for it. Tom, when we were writing it, Tom said, I hate footnotes.
Me too.
I said, okay, well, that's fine. Let's not use footnotes. So that's when we decided to do that.
Well,
and we have a lot of positive comments on it.
It really works. It works so well. And I really love that part of it. And again, it's a way to draw you in. Because again, with like the footnotes, like you say, you don't like them. I understand why. Because it pulls you out of what you're doing. Yeah. You have to boom, 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 boom. Okay, then boom, boom, back. No, not so much fun. I like to just go.
I'm sorry. It's kind of like our conversation here. As soon as one thing is mentioned, it sparks 15 memories for me. And Tom and I are like this. Which one are we going to talk about?
I was going to say, and we'll wrap this up, but we're having you back. I mean, that's a done deal, right? Especially when the book comes out. But before then, and for next season, we're excited for our season 5. So we will have all of you back. It's been so fascinating. I have so many more questions, but we'll save it for the next time. So thank you, Bob Souza,
thank you for having us.
Tom Lange, and Joan Renner.
Thank you.
And here's to Larry.
Yeah, and here's to Larry. Cheers to Larry. The Dating Game Killer was written and directed by Larry Brand and produced by Rebecca Reynolds, Tracy Pattin, and Jim Carpenter for Hollywood and Crime. Producers wish to thank retired LAPD detectives Tom Lange and Bob Souza, co-authors of Malice in Wonderland, and author and social historian Joan Renner. Recorded and edited by Julian Nicholson, and mixed by Mark Nieto for the Invisible Studios, West Hollywood. Executive producers Marshall Louis, Stephanie Jens, and Hernan Lopez.
I'm John Stamos, and I want to tell you about a new podcast I'm hosting called The Grand Scheme, Snatching Sinatra. Back in 1963, Barry Keenan was broke, alone, and desperate to save his family from personal and financial ruin. In a final Hail Mary attempt to set things right, Barry rolled the dice on an elaborate scheme so bizarre that it's hard to believe it actually happened. He kidnapped Frank Sinatra Jr. This is a complicated story of one imperfect man trying to redeem himself by pulling off the perfect crime. We get a first-hand account of what it's like to see a harebrained scheme like this from start to finish from the guy who concocted the scheme in the first place. And Barry shares every detail, every plot twist, every goofy character he conned along the way. The Grand Scheme premieres on July 27th on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you're listening right now. Or you can binge all the episodes right now when you subscribe to Wondery Plus and the Wondery app.